when you have 5 out of 6 agreeing that the person is guilty to start with, then they usually, 81% of the time, find for guilty. And the same is true at the other extreme. When you have 5 out of 6 thinking the person is innocent to begin with, then with 89% probability they find for not guilty. But an interesting thing that we've observed in this study, and had been observed in several other studies, is that in these juries that we were looking at, they hung a lot, yes, when there was an initial disagreement, but when they did manage to reach a decision, it was more likely to be a decision for not guilty than it was for guilty. So in this study that we did in '85, we found that it was about 5 times more likely that an evenly split initial jury would find for not guilty than for guilty. Now, we did what's called a meta-analysis across 13 studies to try to look at that pattern, and we found that indeed across those studies that if you had an even split at the start of deliberation and you managed to reach a verdict, if all that was true, the probability that you found for not guilty was about 80%. So it was really about 4 times more likely that you'd find for not guilty than that you would find for guilty. And that's sort of what we found in this 1985 study. And we also found in our meta-analysis, as we had found in this study, that majorities that were in favor of not guilty were, all other things being equal, more likely to prevail than equal size majorities for a conviction. So we found in that study that if you had a one-third minority for not guilty, that it would prevail almost always, 94% of the time. But if you had an equally large minority for guilty, it would only prevail about 2/3 of the time. What that suggests is that when there's an even split, or even when there's not an even split, the people who are arguing for not guilty seem to have more ability to convince other people than people who are arguing for guilty. Now we call that in that 1995, 85, or 1988 meta-analysis a leniency bias, a tendency, all other things being equal, to be lenient, that is, to find in favor of the defendant. That raises a very interesting question, which is, why does that happen? One suggestion was that these studies that we were summarizing and looking at were mostly done with student simulated juries, and maybe students are simply more lenient than older, more representative juries. So we did a study where we compared mock juries that were evenly split to begin with 2 people for guilty and 2 people for not guilty, and they were composed either completely of students, or there were people recruited from the general community that were older and were non-students. And the question was, would we find this leniency bias, this tendency to find for not guilty, simply among the students but not among the non-students? Well, first among students, when we had 21 juries that were split equally that managed to reach a decision, 7 of them couldn't reach a decision at all, but among those that did reach a decision, they were much more likely to find for not guilty than guilty. Only 3 found for guilty, 18 found for not guilty in that sample of 21 student mock juries. But interestingly, when you look at non-student juries, they also were more likely to find for not guilty. That is, 10 of the 15 that we were able to look at found for not guilty, and only 5 were able to find for guilty. And when you compare statistically the students and non-students, you don't really conclude there's a big enough difference to consider it statistically significant. That is, it's probably not the fact that they're the same, but the best we can judge, they are the same, that there really are no differences between the students and non-students. So the first conclusion was that this leniency bias is not at least wholly attributable to who's making the decision, that even non-students will show this tendency. Well, a second possibility, which we explored in the second study, was that maybe it's built into the way that juries reach their decisions. So this time we looked at student mock juries, but we compared juries that were given 2 different ways of trying to reach their decision. One used the standard way, which in criminal trials, jurors are almost always told that they must use a reasonable doubt standard, which means that you basically have to give the defendant the benefit of any reasonable doubts about their guilt. So that says that when things are close and you can't decide, you should go for the defendant, and this is all intended to try to be extra fair to people who are accused of committing crimes. But the other half of the juries that we looked at were given a different decision rule, and this is not actually used in criminal trials in the United States, but it is used in civil trials, and that's what's called a preponderance of evidence rule. And that rule says that whichever side has the strongest evidence should win. That is, you don't give any benefit of the doubt to one side versus the other side. If one side can make a slightly stronger case for its verdict than the other side, then that's the one that should win. So the question is this leniency bias the result of the fact that jurors are told to give the defendant the benefit of any doubt? And what we found in our study was that indeed, when you had a reasonable doubt rule given to the jurors, we found the usual asymmetry. That is, of those groups that found a verdict at all, 74% of them found for not guilty, only about 25% of them found for guilty, when they began with 2 for guilty and 2 for not guilty. So that's the same pattern that had been shown in lots and lots of other studies. Now the question is, what happens when you tell jurors that they don't give the defendant the benefit of the doubt, that both sides are essentially on an even level playing field? That's the preponderance of evidence decision rule, scheme. And what we found was that they were pretty nearly equal. So when they reached a decision at all, they were slightly more likely. That is, 58% reached a not guilty verdict, and the remaining were for guilty. But that difference was not statistically different from a 50-50 split. We couldn't. The split that we got could occur very easily by chance alone, if in fact there was an underlying 50-50 split among all such juries. So the upshot of that is that this leniency bias, the tendency by juries to favor the defendant, seems to be due to the rules that they are given to reach their deliberations with, this reasonable doubt standard. And that has lots of other interesting implications. So for example, I won't be able to go into detail about this, but it seems that when you have individual judges